I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. So Praveen Gupta is a senior director and also practicing consultant with Neo Group. Neo Group is one of the newer advisory kids on the block, but they actually won the GSA Advisory Firm of the Year last year. So congratulations on that, Praveen, for Neo, and welcome. And the floor is yours.
No, thank you. Thank you, Kerry, for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. Uh, Thanks, everyone, for joining. So the next 10 minutes, I'll spend talking about our experiences at Neo, contracting and buying new technology. Uh, 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 let me uh, let me share my screen right away here. Is the screen visible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, so when we say new technology, in simple terms, if I have to define what is new technology, it pertains to everything that really in the field of IT that does not pertain to an FT or an underlying infrastructure asset. So all the new technologies that you see over here, uh, I'll not go through each of them, but these are our view of new technologies. Uh, a lot of work we have been doing is around cloud and industrial automation. So most of my discussion will be centered around this, but uh, what we talk about would generally be applicable across most of these new tech areas. Uh, so with that introduction to new technologies, I'll move into some of the key recommendations that we have when buying and contracting for new technologies. I spend the next 8 minutes, 2 minutes with each of the recommendations. These are, of course, not the only ones, but in the interest of time, we had to find the really key ones. So number one is we need to contract for ambiguity and uncertainty. When dealing with new technologies, it's not like conventional sourcing, right? Where we really are defining very tight boundaries for the supplier, and we say, okay, these are the requirements. You have to adhere to these requirements and come back with the solution. Come back with the end state. We know the end state in these cases in conventional sourcing, but really in new techs, we are not aware of the end state. We do not know what this transformation might lead us into, right? So what we do in sourcing for new techs is uh, we do it incrementally. We go one step at a time. We set up the enablers so that we can make assessments. We can identify areas that need to be transformed, and then as those areas are identified, we do further rounds of sourcing uh, to transform those identified areas, and that's what we call agile sourcing. It's more iterative, and you are kind of exploring exploring something in contrast to conventional sourcing, where you have a destination in mind and you are just targeting that destination. You are straight away going to that. So that's the difference between conventional and the new techs. And how does it translate in the actual contract? So in actual contracts, you will see a lot of contracts are based on consumption ranges, volume ranges. They won't be absolute numbers like we have in like conventional sourcing. Uh, you would have a rate plan rather than a committed volume. You'd have different tiers for rates, right? Charge rates, for example, for different tiers of consumption. So all that ambiguity has to be it, basically on all that ambiguity is what you are trying to address by having this kind of a contract. So that's the first thing I wanted to leave this group and rest of you with, so that we can discuss more on this. Let me turn off this. Some notifications I'm getting, so I need to turn off this. This IM. Okay. So the second thing is, So when dealing with new technology, and this is specifically pertaining to cloud and allied technologies, we have two ways of sourcing. One is sourcing directly from the hyperscalers. The hyperscalers, as you know, the AWS and the GCPs of the world, AWS, Azure, GCP, Oracle Cloud, hardly 4 or 5 of them that are there in the industry. And if you contract with them, there is perception of greater control. There is perception of, and it's true as well. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not true. It's you have greater control, but what you don't have is that you are kind of contracting only for a very specific area, which is infrastructure as a service. You would have to really build a lot of things. You would have to really build a number of allied uh, products and services around this to have a successful transformation. And all those allied services, when dealing with hyperscalers, we can get it from their marketplaces and their alliance partners. Uh, so that is one mode of sourcing. But the other mode is sourcing with the managed service providers. If you source the same set of services from managed services providers, who in turn also operate as cloud resellers. So they will be providing you cloud services. They'll also be in turn negotiating on your behalf with the other providers, which is providers of industrial devices, providers of IoT sensors, etc. Uh, so all those basically the task of integrating multiple engagements and the uh, task of ensuring that you are operating at an optimum level with each of these small sourcing engagements, sourcing for AI/ML, sourcing for tax, etc., is taken care of by the MSP. And typically MSPs um, are more capable of getting the best deals compared to buyers, because as buyers we have very limited as buyers and representative of buyers, for example, as advisors, we have very limited access to benchmarks on these new areas like IoT and AI/ML, and that's where the challenges start. So I'm not leaving you with any recommendation on this, but this is again a discussion item. There's no right or wrong answer on which approach to take. And I guess Kit is on the panel, and he'll be speaking more about these things when it goes to him, because yeah, so he's. I'll move on to the next one just in the interest of time. The third one is when dealing with new techs. Please interrupt me if you need to. Otherwise, leave questions on the chat, and I'll try to address them at the end. The third one is keep a tab on the commitments you make. What I'm suggesting here and what we have observed doing new tech deals is the industry is really changing very fast. Deals that we did 3 years ago, we realized that we could have done something differently. There's a new provider who's providing something far better, and now we don't have an exit path, right? There are this particular industry, and like many others, these industries operate in economies of scale, which means the bigger the pie, the lesser is their cost, and which means there is a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and eventually the industry ends up being an oligopoly. We have seen this with operating systems, like you have only Windows, iOS, and Android, for example. We have seen this with public cloud industry, AWS, Azure, GCP. I mean, maybe Oracle Cloud. Not many providers, but look at how many providers we have on industrial IoT, for example. Look at how many providers we have on AI and ML. There are small and medium enterprises and a number of them, which we don't know whether they'll exist 5 years from now. And that's why we strongly recommend not to contract for term longer than 3 years without an exit option. Uh, we strongly recommend not to trade in flexibility to pay per use in return for discounts. I mean, it's tempting to get discounts, volume discounts, and discounts for commitment for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. but we strongly recommend not to go into this. And we also, in our experience, we when we do these deals, we only commit about half of the volumes of what we actually expect to consume. I'd leave this slide with this statement. I mean, cloud, industrial IoT, they were designed for pay as you go, right? They were never designed for a take or pay pricing. And that's what this slide talks about. The fourth thing is, so this is not very strategic, it's a bit tactical, but I still wanted to leave you with this because we are increasingly seeing CPI has become a hot topic, especially in the last 2 years with what has happened, how CPI is the consumer price index or the retail price index in some geographies. This has shot through the roof in the last year or two post-COVID. So what we are seeing is that suppliers are insisting on a CPI linked increase in prices. But as buyers and representative of buyers, we are pushing back on suppliers in especially on suppliers which are not tied, whose services are not tied to an FTE, new technologies, right? They are not tied to an FTE. They are not tied to an underlying asset. In all probability, what you are, for example, if you are renewing a contract, in all probability, the initial cost of the license has already been paid off, has already been recovered. Typical break even for SaaS products is 3 years. So any kind of renewals, we have to insist on continuous productivity and price improvements, and kind of not go for a CPI based increase. That is our fourth recommendations. We have successfully done this with some of the vendors. We have been unsuccessful with some, but this is something that we need to keep in mind. So yeah, that's it from me. I'd like to open the discussion to the panel and hear more from everyone in the panel as well as in the audience.
That's great. Thank you, Praveen. You made some pretty provocative statements there, and I'm going to be really interested in speaking to the rest of the panel to see whether they agree with some of those statements or whether they could counter those.